Have you ever been riding along and seen a bike next to you with what looks like a really big and funny looking engine bolted on sideways? Or maybe you went to a dealership and threw a leg over a BMW R1250 GS and smacked your shins into the cylinder heads and asked yourself, what's the deal with these goofy flat plane engines? Well, much like cars, motorcycles come in a variety of shapes and sizes with about as many different kinds of engines powering them. Today we thought it'd be fun to pull a Seinfeld and ask, what's the deal with longitudinal engines? Why do some manufacturers seem to use them almost exclusively and others not want to touch them with a 10-foot barge pole? If you're an inline 4 sport bike simp, stick with us for this video because you'll probably learn something, and learning stuff is good. Gotta get you more knowledge, then maybe you too can make horrible YouTube ads pointing at a Lamborghini in your garage. And who knows, maybe if this video takes off, we can look at the history of other kinds of engines and what makes them special and unique. Although I'm sure next week we'll make some video titled The 7 Ways Noobs Turn into Squids or something, and it'll have 100,000 views. No, I'm not upset, y'all want the same thing every week, I'm just maybe a little disappointed. Almost disappointed as I am that you're not following our good example and using a cardo on your helmet. If you're some jixer degenerate, then you really should get a helmet. It'll keep your melon nice and unexploded for when you inevitably loop your bike trying to flex, but it'll also allow you the experience and the fun of riding with the cardo. You might be thinking that I'll just ride with noise-canceling earbuds and listen to music that way, to which I ask, have you ever put a helmet on before? It just doesn't really work that well. Cardo makes it easy with quality JBL speakers mounted directly to the inside of your helmet, so they're in the right place every time, and yes, they are loud enough to hear through earplugs. Better still, they'll allow you to debate the merits of longitudinal engines versus transverse engines with your buddies while you ride. They've got best-in-class range and battery life so you can ride all day long and probably the next few days without charging. Seriously, I forget to charge mine all the time and it always seems to have battery life in it. Also, they've got a wide range of products at different price points so you can get the unit that makes sense for you. Click that link down below and get yourself a cardo so I don't have to be disappointed in you anymore. That's no fun for me, and the solution is just so simple. Alright, let's get into the meat of today's video and start at the beginning. What is the difference between a transverse mounted engine and a longitudinal engine? Simply put, a transverse engine is one where the crankshaft is mounted perpendicular to the frame, while the longitudinal engines have the crank in line with the frame. But yammy, doesn't it have to do with the orientation of the cylinders? Nope. Think about inline 4s have engines mounted like a Gucci where they run perpendicular to the frame, but their output shaft is transverse instead of longitudinal. Same with parallel twins. It's got nothing to do with the orientation of the cylinders, even though that's a common misconception because a lot of famous examples of longitudinal engines have the cylinders running across the frame instead of in line with it. So to make that a little simpler, let's take a look at perhaps as with the easiest place to see the differences between a Moto Guzzi V-twin versus a Harley V-twin or a Ducati V-twin or any quote-unquote normal V-twin that you're used to seeing. Let's start with the obvious. On a transverse V-twin, there's a front cylinder and a back cylinder, whereas on a longitudinal engine, there's a left and right cylinder. This creates different forces within the motorcycle, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But before we get into that, we need to talk about how these engines are packaged. When you think of a motorcycle engine, they're usually one big chunk with the engine and the transmission in one big case, unlike a car where you can have more separate engine and transmission. What this means is that by turning the engine 90 degrees inside of the frame, you're turning the output shaft of the engine. Think about a Ducati where you have the output shaft running perpendicular or transverse to the frame along with the rear axle. This makes driving that rear wheel incredibly simple just by hooking up a chain and sprocket. That's why normally you don't see motorcycles with transverse engines running a drive shaft. Honda tried it back in the day with the CB900C and it was a colossal nightmare. On that motorcycle, the output shaft was on the wrong side of the bike, meaning that they had to have a transfer case and two 90-degree joints to drive the rear wheel. Even if you have a left side mounted shaft simply replacing the chain, you'd have to set one gears in the rear wheel hub and the shaft between the engine and the rear wheel. More on that in a little bit. Going back to our Ducati engine though, if you rotate it at 90 degrees in the frame so the output shaft is running parallel with the frame, that means the power is coming from the engine and needs to go through at least one 90-degree bend before it hits the rear wheel, hence the pairing of longitudinal engines and shaft drives. Go take a quick look at a Moto Guzzi's website and try to find a bike with a chain on it. And while we're at it, let's bring up some famous examples of longitudinal engines in motorcycles. Along with basically every Guzzi ever, there's one more super famous famous longitudinal engine you Beamer boys have been waiting so patiently for me to mention it, so here you go. The BMW Boxer Twin, found in the GS, R1250 GS, and RT models, R18, and any other bike with a cylinder sticking out of the sides. They've basically been using this engine since cavemen first chiseled it out of stone at the dawn of time, and they're probably never going to get rid of it because that would be like Ducati switching to a 60-degree V-twin or an inline 4. You'll also find longitudinal engines in Honda's Goldwing, the CX500 from the 80s, and that weird CTX 1300 V4 they made for a year. There's a few other smaller manufacturers from way back in the day that used longitudinally mounted engines, but that was back when no one really knew how to build a motorcycle, and some of them had hand shifters and the brake where the clutch should be. The early 1900s were truly motorcycling's dark age. The next question you're probably asking is why you would want to mount an engine longitudinally, or why would you not? Let's start with the drivetrain, because longitudinally mounted engines usually ship with drive shafts. It can drastically cut down on the maintenance you have to do at home. You don't need to lube your drive shafts every 6,000 miles like a standard chain, and you don't have to worry about chain tightness, wear, or wheel alignment. You just pop the wheel off and put it right back on and you're ready and set to go. However, if you do ever have an issue with the drive shaft, regardless of how unlikely that is, your repair bills are going to be astronomical. But it's that lack of regular maintenance that makes these bikes super desirable for people traveling long distances. You don't have to worry about carrying chain cleaners, spare master links, riveting tools, and all that stuff when you go. You can put down tens of thousands of miles on a bike and not worry about it. On the other hand, because the shaft needs to spin through a hub to get the power down to the wheel, and the fact that a shaft is set up much heavier than a chain and sprocket, these bikes tend to perform worse than a transversely mounted engine, which is why the S1000RR has a chain, and while pretty much all the other Beamers don't. There's less power lost to a properly tuned chain and sprocket than there is to a drive shaft. You can quickly and cheaply alter the final drive gearing on the bike, and while chains need more maintenance over their lifetime, they're much cheaper to replace if a problem arises. Beyond the drivetrain, there's an added benefit of having more room for the cylinders on a longitudinal engine. You can install a much larger engine into a smaller frame if they can stick out of the sides. Think back to the Harley-Davidson Model W, which had a flat twin mounted transversely. It had a longer wheelbase and a smaller engine to make it work, compromising the handling of the bike and making it a nightmare to service. But it was the 20s, and again, the dark ages of motorcycling. Imagine how long the GS would have to be to fit that massive 1200cc boxer twin between the wheels if they mounted it transversely. A nice benefit to having more room for cylinders is opening up the opportunity for a flat twin 4 or 6 configuration, as it lowers the center of gravity on these bikes, making them easier to manage at slow speeds or easier to balance at a stop. Lastly, since the heads stick out of the sides of the frame, longitudinal engines are much easier to service when you need the top end work done. Checking the valves on a BMW can be done by just about anyone with the right tools without having to remove a ton of bodywork, but let's be real, ain't nobody working on their own BMW at home. So far, we've talked a lot about what the key differences are and some of the pros and cons, but let's take a moment to chat about how a longitudinal engine rides compared to a transverse engine. When you rev a V-twin, the engine has a tendency to twist thanks to all the torque they produce. In a transversely mounted bike, you'll see the front cylinder lift up and the rear move down like it's almost trying to do a backflip. This is why when you see real boys on their 131 baggers revving their bike, the whole thing seems like it squats under the power of the engine. There's so much torque that the engine is literally compressing the rear shock. On a cruiser, that amounts to a lot of tickling in the tender regions, massaging in all the right places, while on a sport bike, that makes for a wheelie-happy power plant, even more wheelie-happy. Those forces would need to be compensated for, either in the way that the weight is distributed throughout the bike or by changing the rear shock to be a little bit stiffer. On a longitudinally mounted motorcycle, however, the twisting motion created by that engine coupled with the turn of the drive shaft means the whole bike will rotate side to side when you rev it. It's a fun little party trick when you're sitting at a stoplight, and some people really enjoy the feeling. Some people claim they can feel the twisting action when they're applying the power mid-corner, though at usual street paces, that's probably just a placebo effect more than anything. At pace around a racetrack, sure, maybe there's some racers who can feel the twisting forces either working against or with them, but then no one races these kinds of bikes really. Since longitudinal engines typically come with drive shafts though, you do feel the drive shaft working. When you get on the throttle, the whole motorcycle feels like it's jumping up and down. It's a strange sensation at first, and you either learn to love it or hate it. You'll hear Gucci apologists say that it adds character, and longitudinal bike traditionalists say that it's distracting, but it's all a matter of personal preference really. So So let's wrap up what we've learned. Transverse versus longitudinal engines on a motorcycle have to deal with the direction of the crankshaft, not the direction of the cylinders. If the crank sticks out of the side of the engine, it's transverse. If it sticks out of the back, it's longitudinal. Longitudinally mounted bikes typically use drive shafts with a rear hub to turn the wheel, whereas transverse engines use chains or belts. You don't see longitudinal engines in racing because their drivetrains are heavy and can't be easily modified, but they are very low maintenance. Also, since the cylinders stick out of the side of the engine, it's typically easier to work on. Is one better than the other? No, it's all about how you're planning on using the motorcycle. Now, cue all the keyboard warriors and their pitchforks claiming that one is vastly superior and only a troglodyte would use the other. Fact. Volvo gave away the 1962 patent for their revolutionary 3-point seatbelt for free in order to save lives. Goodbye.
Keep watching Yami News.